People who have straight up rage quit a job. What was the final straw? Story 1. My manager started snapping her fingers in my face, 3 inches away from my eyes, saying in a slow drawl, "You're doing it wrong. Hello, that's not how I told you to do it," when I was folding the shirt somewhat slower and less optimally than I was shown, though achieving the same fold. Also, it was my third week and one of 20 folds I had to learn on that job. I walked right then and there. Story 2, I worked for a call center for AT&T. I refused to try and sell a DirecTV package to a woman who was literally bawling her eyes out on the phone because she was having to switch her phone plan to her name instead of her husband's name because he had just died. Story 3, I was a receptionist for a medical software company. Boss refused my request for a single day off to take my teen daughter to get eye surgery. I waited until the first day of her 2-week vacation and put in my notice. Ruined her holiday. Story 4, I was waiting tables while I was in grad school. I had requested a weekend off far in advance, right after I got my syllabus, because there was a seminar pertinent to a class. Our professor expected us to go and write a paper. It was a decent chunk of our grade. The weekend comes up, and lo and behold, I'm scheduled doubles Friday through Sunday. I hunt down the manger and say I can't do that, and I've given months' notice. She pulls the requests are just requests, not guarantees. And I tell her point blank, I will fail this class if I don't go. She shrugged, she said, that isn't my problem. I told her is now and left. Like hell, I was going fail a class for my master's degree, waiting tables at a fucking rainforest cafe. Story 5, the company told me I was to enforce 2 new policies. 1, all employees must report to work 15 minutes early for their shift. However, they would not be paid for that time. 2, all employees must take their unpaid lunch break in specific areas under very specific circumstances. I told them we needed to have a meeting to discuss the legality of their new policies before I could enforce them on my team. They replied, either you enforce the policies or you resign your position. I said, see ya. They begged me to reconsider and to not make a bad decision just because I was upset. Unfortunately, I was already out the door. Story 6. This was 20 years ago. My fiancée had been hospitalized for 16 months after a car accident. When she passed away, my boss would not let me have time off for bereavement because we were not legally married. Story 7. I was working when I got the call that my partner of 7 years had been in a terrible car accident while visiting family in Florida. He was in the hospital and his mother called me to tell me he wasn't awake yet. I was obviously devastated and scared out of my mind. Told my coworkers and boss because it was obvious I was panicking, and they told me to take the rest of the weekend off so I could deal with things and prepare and clean his apartment for when if he got back. Specifically, they said to come back Monday, and it was a Friday. Next day, I was cleaning up his apartment when I got the call from my boss screaming about why I hadn't come into work that day. I told him that I recalled him telling me to take the weekend off and come back Monday. He said to come to work immediately because they needed me. Against my better judgment and my emotional state, I showed up and clocked in. Boss came up to me, threw the stack of checks down on the counter that had just come in, and told me, if you do that again, you're fired. This was someone who had never yelled at me before, or even dared speak to me in any stern way. Prior to my arrival, their store was an absolute mess, and I spent all of my free time, what little there was, reorganizing and cleaning and setting up new systems. For some reason, the fact he chose to start speaking to me this way and demanding my attention now at that time, it just made me snap. A chord was struck and it resonated strong. I got the message clearly. He was one of those bosses who became controlling of anyone who became of value to him in his business. The moment you aren't available when they need or even wanted you to be, they were going to make you feel bad about it, so you were afraid to ask for more personal time or any other leniencies that took you away from work. I was literally reeling, saw red. The moment he turned his back, I snatched my check, walked out with a full line of customers at the counter and the phone going off with incoming orders, and drove off. He blew up my phone all day, never came back or called back. Fortunately, he made it home safe and healed up fine. Unfortunately, he passed away on our anniversary a few years later. I regret every moment I passed up to spend time with him over that job, or any job for that matter. Story 8. Many years ago, while working in a manufacturing facility, my boss came into work already pissed off because his wife served him divorce papers. Saying good morning was apparently enough to set him off, and he picked up a wrench from the table and threw it at my head. I ducked. It missed. Then I just closed my toolbox and wheeled it to the truck low. Story 9. One very busy night while waitressing, I was standing at a table of 12 in the middle of taking their order when another waitress came up to me and said our boss wanted us in their office that instant. So I leave my full section in the middle of chaos to go see what the problem is. My boss began to chew us both out because the other girl asked if I would switch shifts with her, and I had agreed. I didn't say anything but was obviously annoyed because I had just left all my tables thinking there was some sort of emergency. My boss looked at me and asked why I looked mad, and I told him, I feel like this could have been sorted out without me. If you didn't want her to leave early, you could have just told her no instead of pulling me away from our customers. They said, if you're going to have an attitude, get your shit and leave. I said okay and went to transfer my tables. I was over it. I had worked there 3 years and the owners were alcoholics that treated us like garbage and spent all the company on themselves instead of getting ingredients to make food or paying their employees. The other waitress came back out and said our boss wanted me back in the office. I went in and they said, put your apron back on, you're not fired. I said, you're both fucking crazy if you think you can treat people the way you do and expect them to want to work for you. And I walked out. As I was leaving, they came out behind me saying I would regret it and was never allowed back if I left. I threw up my middle fingers and kept walking. Funny part is I let my boyfriend take my car to work that night, so I had to walk a mile home and break into my house. Story 10 was having a meeting with the boss who was a difficult guy to work with, and he stood up and punched the wall. He wasn't doing it jokingly. He bare-knuckled went at the wall of his own office like he was in the gym hitting a punching bag. I sat there in astonishment for about 2 seconds, then stood up and left. Cleared out my desk, exited through the back door without a word to anyone. There's no place for that conduct in the professional world, even if the guy does own the company. Story 11, he wouldn't train me properly, then come yell at me in front of the office. He would always threaten my job or like hiring someone else, and I finally said, good, I hope you find someone better, because I quit and will be leaving once other lady comes back from lunch. He tried to backpedal and ask if I was serious. I never looked back, ETA. He hired me without any experience because he knew he could lowball me. I got paid pennies for what someone with experience would get paid. Story 12. At one office job, I quit after the first day because the lady training me would ignore me when our manager wasn't around, and I caught her snooping through my purse when I went to the bathroom. At another job at a clinic, I quit after a month because they made me do a solo receptionist shift without training me on what I needed to do to open the clinic, and then I got yelled at for not knowing what to do in front of patients. It was so bad, some of the patients came up to me after and asked if I was okay. Story 13. I never have, but my favorite example was when a coworker in student transportation, who had finally gotten a position she wanted after years of suffering through stress in another, was called by management over the summer and told she was being reassigned to the stressful position because no one else wanted to do it. She had fought too long and hard to get what she wanted, and her immediate response was, then tell me what I need to do to resign. She did, and she's been at peace with her decision ever since. Story 14. I was exhausted, had been working 50-plus hour weeks, and couldn't wait until Christmas break. I was the only person out of 25 required to work Saturday mornings on a 6-week fundraiser in addition to my regular hours. Others were only scheduled once. I was scheduled all 6 Saturdays. Finally, a foreign colleague wanted to work Christmas so she could go to her home country early in the next year. The entire office was supposed to be closed for those 2 weeks. The boss picked me to be with her and refused to let me say no. I didn't want to take a break later when the rest of my family would have been off over Christmas, and I couldn't bear to have waited another 2 weeks as I was barely hanging on right then. She wouldn't let it go, so I quit. The boss decided to work with her herself. That was fine with me. The mystery is why it had to be me or her out of 25 coworkers. Well, not my problem. Story 15. Not me, but a colleague once wrote a long stinker of an email, hit send at 10:30 a.m., and exited the building immediately. He blind copied all receivers, but sent it to multiple departments of a large multinational I was working at, No one knew who didn't get the email, except for the gaffes and OMGs around the office. He was completely disgruntled and went in on multiple managers, supervisors, and various colleagues with absolute venom. It was amazing. Still the best work email I've ever received, and some shit he called out actually had to be addressed by management. It brought about a lot of positive change. If you're out there, Khalil, that was awesome. Story 16, I was a supervisor of housekeeping at a hotel. Every holiday, all of management would take off, leaving me the highest in charge. I asked for a raise after working a full year of holidays as the only management and was denied the next year on the biggest party day in the city. I set all my employees up with their work and texted the managers a picture of me at the bar partying, telling them the hotel might be on fire. I don't know, I quit. Story 17, when I was 20, I worked a commission-based sales job. The manager hated me for some reason. I genuinely, to this day, have no idea why. I tried really hard, had a good attitude, and followed all the rules. My sales weren't extraordinary, but I always met my numbers. My grandmother died about 6 months into the job. I texted my manager to tell him I'd be taking my 3 days of bereavement as allowed by the union. I even apologized for the inconvenience, as though I could control my grandmother's death. He called me the day after she died, accusing me of lying, saying I was lazy and just wanted the time off. Keep in mind, I'd never called out before or even been more than 5 minutes late to a shift. I sent him medical documentation proving she'd had a stroke during the night and passed away. He called me back and said fine, I could have that day off, but he better see me the next day, my 3rd day of union-protected bereavement, or I'd be fired. Stricken with grief but terrified of losing my job, I drove the 2 hours back to my apartment from the grandmother's house that night. The next morning, I went into work tired and melancholy. He bitched at me to smile because no one wants to buy cell phones from a sad girl. I plastered on a smile and hit the sales floor. At lunchtime, I cried my eyes out in my car, reapplied my makeup, went back to work with my fake smile. I was in the middle of helping a customer when he comes bouldering up to the table and starts asking the customer all the same questions. I had to see what products they'd be eligible for. The customer was baffled and told him I'd already covered everything and that no further help was necessary. He went on a rant about what a terrible, useless employee I was. I looked at the customer and deadpan said, I'm so sorry to leave you with him, but as of this moment, I quit. The manager followed me to the break room, shouting and raving, while I gathered my purse, turned in my equipment, and clocked out. He followed me to my car, still berating me. Finally, that same customer I walked away from came out and physically stood between me and the manager so I could get in my car and drive away. The manager proceeded to call me every day for a week and leave abusive voicemails about me missing shifts because he didn't accept my resignation. He even called me the day of my grandmother's funeral and said now that she'd been cremated, I had no excuse not to come back to work. Fuck AT&T and fuck that douche Jeremy. I hope he eventually got a taste of his own medicine. Story 18 was promised that if I got my accounting degree, they would move me to IA so I could get hours towards my CPA. Worked my ass off, graduated, and the boss said, yeah, we're going to move you to customer service. Sound good? Stayed late that night drafting a company-wide fuck you email. Probably shouldn't have done that in hindsight, but some bridges just beg to be burned. Story 19. The owner of the company told me to fire a woman for arriving to work right on time. It was always something different with him, some ridiculous new rule that he applied retroactively to suit whatever mood he was in on any given day. In that particular morning, he took it as a personal insult and a show of blatant disrespect that his employees didn't arrive early. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't fire this woman, who I didn't even particularly like, to satisfy this new whim of his. So instead of firing her, I marched into his office and quit myself. Funnily enough, the woman I wouldn't fire continued working for him for years. She might even still be there now, 20-some years later. Story 20, I was flat out lied to about the position. It was a management position at a residential mental health facility, and I had taken it, leaving a great paying but stressful position, because it wouldn't require travel and was supposed to be much more laid back. On top of many other issues, I ended up having to work 8 weeks straight without a single day off, even weekends and one holiday. So after a very heated meeting with upper management where one person was flat out lying to cover their own butt, I sent a resignation email from the parking lot.